The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this week I'm so excited to share this chat with you that I had with author Jac Jemc, whose new book, Empty Theater, just came out yesterday, actually. So if you check her website, she's doing a lot of promotional events and things, and you can learn more about it. But the thing is, it's like this book was written specifically for you, the listeners, and me, aka the Tits Out Brigade, because this book involves Lola Montez. It's got lots of scandaliciousness. It's primarily about Empress Sisi, who we all know about, and her cousin Ludwig, who we talked a bit about in that episode. It's also written in a really interesting and innovative way that I really vibed with, and I think you will too. And also, if you're like, I don't know if I've heard of Jac Jemc, you might have seen her face before, because if you follow me on Instagram, if you scroll down a little bit, there's a picture of Jac posing at the grave of Lola Montez that she shared with me before this interview and that I posted on Instagram. Anyway, it was such a fun time just like geeking out with her about various historical people, and I hope you enjoy this chat with Jac Jemc. Okay, so I'm joined here today by Jac Jemc, author of the book. Well, actually, so the book title is Empty Theater, but can you, from memory, or not memory, can you say the full title of it? I was just curious, can you?
I can read it to you, but I don't actually have it memorized. And I realized recently, I really, it is my responsibility to memorize it at this point. I mean,
it is your title. I assume you invented, so.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I can't recite it. Do you want me to read it, though?
Could you read it?
Yes. Empty Theater, or The Lives of King Ludwig II of Bavaria and Empress Sisi of Austria, parentheses, Queen of Hungary, end parentheses, comma, cousins, comma, in their pursuit of connection and beauty, despite the expectations placed on them, because of the exceptional good fortune of their status as beloved national figures, period, with speculation into the mysterious nature of their deaths, period. For real.
I tried to, when I was just like making a place to save this file, and I copy pasted, and it was just like, that's too long. You can't call it. I was like, interview with Jac Jemc, brackets author of, and then I copy pasted the title, and it was like, error. No, you can't call your title that. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. The full title isn't even on Amazon or the Macmillan page, like my publisher's page, So I'm like, I guess you only know about the title in full if you have the actual book.
Yeah, but I mean, the title really, just so everybody knows who's listening, this is a book about, how do you pronounce it? Sisi? Sisi?
I say Sisi, yeah.
I truly don't know how to say it, but it's about Sisi, who we've talked about on this podcast before. Ludwig, who I find fascinating. Your book also delves into, and I do want to just talk about this. Lola Montez is in this book. And I'm talking to you like I'm meeting you for the first time, Jac, but your picture is on the Vulgar History Instagram page because it's a picture you sent me of yourself at the grave of Lola Montez. Can you explain what you were doing there?
Yeah. So we could get into this, but there was a much larger section of Lola Montez in the book, and I have a short story that's all Lola Montez that has yet to be published. But I was visiting a friend in Brooklyn, and we were like trying to decide where to go for a walk, and my friend suggested, I don't even remember the name of the cemetery now. It's like Green something. Anyway, I could look it up, but my friend suggested going for a walk in the Greenwood Cemetery, in the cemetery, which is very appropriate to me. And I said, yes, absolutely. And we got there and we picked up a map and looked at the list of people buried there. I was like, oh my God, Lola Montez, I forgot. Like, I knew that she had been buried in New York, but had forgotten that it was something that I could go and try to find. So we went, we walked, we like kind of shaped our walk around going to see her grave. And it's so funny because her gravestone does not say Lola Montez. It says Eliza Gilbert.
I think it says Mrs.
Eliza Gilbert. Correct. Yeah. Which, the Eliza Gilbert part is the name that she was born with, but she was never Mrs. Eliza Gilbert. And there's no other markers there. So anyone who is interested in Lola Montez but who maybe didn't know that her given name when she was born, wouldn't even know that was the grave they were looking for, because there's no explanation in the map or anything like that either. So I just thought that was so funny.
I love that you kind of happened upon it, because when I did the Lola Montez episode and I read that she was buried in New York, I'm like, oh, this is exciting, because I know I have a lot of listeners in the United States. I'm in Canada, but right. I mostly talk about other places. And I'm like, oh, this is a place, and maybe someone who's listening can maybe go and see this grave. So I was like, if any of you are there, if you want to go see the grave. And one intrepid listener was messaging me. She was trying to find, I think it's so confusing to find the grave, because that's not what it said. It's Lola Montez on the map. You have to go there, know that that's the alias you're looking for. So I love that you just kind of oh, Lola Montez is here. And you are a person who has researched her and you knew, oh, Eliza Gilbert, that's the grave. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because that's the confusing thing too, is they have her listed as Lola Montez on the map and say nothing about under the name Eliza Gilbert. Yeah. So I too, when we arrived to it, I was like, where is she? Where is she? And it was like, oh, right. I remember that there are all these inaccuracies on the headstone.
Doesn't it? It has her wrong age at death as well. It's the grave itself is.
Yeah, I think it has her wrong birth date, and then from when she dies calculates her age wrong too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is for her perfect.
Perfect. Yes.
Even in death, she's still pulling a fast one on everybody somehow. But yeah, so I was really excited to know that there was going to be I've read your book. I got an advanced reader copy of it. Everybody should read it. This is mandatory reading for everyone who listens to my podcast. It starts with Lola Montez. I knew because you'd visited her grave. I'm oh, Lola Montez will be in the book. But your book opens with Ludwig the First, the one who she was lovers with. And I was just well, this book starts with Lola Montez. I'm in. I'm already in, because the title is 125 words long. It's about Sisi, and Lola's there too. But can you can you explain what the book is about beyond the title, which I guess does kind of explain what the book is about?
Yeah. So what the book has ended up being, though it's been through so many iterations, is primarily a book about Ludwig II of Bavaria and Empress Sisi of Austria. And they were cousins and also close friends, probably as close a friend for Ludwig as he had. And Sisi always kind of, I think, saw him as kind of like almost like a little brother or something. It's about the kind of the way that they were both iconoclasts within the palaces that they inhabited. And so Ludwig was a very ineffective ruler in terms of protecting Bavaria from absorption into the larger North German Confederation, Prussia, like modern day Germany. And Sisi was kind of not doing her job either, as being a very visible figure of the Austrian crown, and instead favored freedom in all ways, traveling and following her own interests in terms of kind of prioritizing the Hungarian constitution and freedom over the power being imposed by the Habsburg house. And so, yeah, and I should also say that Ludwig, in place of doing his job of protecting Bavaria, was mostly just interested in paying for Wagner's operas and building big frothy castles that were out of their time and that he couldn't afford. So, what happens with him eventually is that he is declared insane by a doctor who's never met him, who was hired by his cabinet to do exactly that. And then he and his doctor are both found murdered very soon after, and no one knows what happens. And then Sisi, and I say all of this in the prologue of the book, so I'm not precious about giving away spoilers or anything. Like we could all look at the historical record if we want to. And Sisi is murdered by an Italian anarchist. So they both meet these kind of untimely ends that, where they're kind of martyred for causes that they're not even particularly, they don't have a particularly strong allegiance to. So yeah, so that's kind of the core of the book. But the reason that I begin with Lola is because there is this kind of historical precedent for the kings in the Bavarian line getting distracted from the primary goal. And so Ludwig I, who's Ludwig II's grandfather, of course, was, seduced by Lola and eventually gives up the crown so he could be with her, but then fails to even be with her.
Right. Ludwig I there's this history in the family of being distracted by favorites. So that's, you start with Ludwig I to sort of establish that. And also just sort of to establish what the situation is that Ludwig II, is he the second or is he the third? Like the main one in your book?
He is the second, yeah, because his father's name is Maximilian. He's not actually, there isn't a second between them,
Yeah, so it just sort of establishes, like, here's what this world is like. And then, so the book kind of goes back and forth, like what Sisi is up to in Bavaria, and then, meeting the emperor and stuff versus like as Ludwig. So it's kind of like, I don't know if it's exactly switching off chapter to chapter, but it's sort of like both of them. Okay, but you alluded to that this book has gone through very many permutations. So like what was it originally? Which storyline were you most excited about? Like, how did this project even come about?
Yeah, so the book definitely started with Ludwig. But then I just started finding all these fascinating women around him. And I was like, well, I don't only want to write about Ludwig. I want to try to bring in some ladies too. And so there was a full Lola storyline through the book at one point. Of course, she like dies before Ludwig does. So it's sort of like cut off at a certain point. And there was also Elizabeth Ney storyline. She's the kind of like sculptress turned spy who sculpts Ludwig, but like Bismarck kind of tries to talk her into winning Ludwig over to his cause. And there was a whole section that was about her. And both of them, after they kind of do their business with the Bavarian crown, left for America and have these long lives. And so there was this kind of latter half of the book where two of the characters' lives were going on in America. And so, a big change. And then there was a point at which I was thinking about having a thread of the narrative devoted to the composer Richard Wagner's wife, Cosima. But then I realized that Cosima was kind of even more awful in terms of all the anti-Semitism and problematic stuff that surrounds Wagner, that like I couldn't find a way to write about her sympathetically. So that got cut first. But yeah, there were definitely the book used to be much longer and just had a lot more kind of threads woven into the braid.
So it was sort of like, I don't know if you know this book, Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, which is not a long book, but it's like, I don't even know, 25 different characters who are all in America in like 1905 or something.
Yeah, like it was 4 storylines instead of what's now basically 2.
Okay. And not having read the previous version of it, I'm all about a Lola Montez based story. But I think this book works so well as Sisi and Ludwig, like just kind of because the two characters and the way the cover is, it's their two heads kind of inverse of each other. It's funny. A few weeks ago, I just shared a portrait I came across of Ludwig. He's wearing these like over the knee boots. Like it's a really stylish looking portrait. And I posted it and somebody was like, oh my God, this is boy Sisi. Like his face, his lips, like physically, the two of them look very similar. So I think it's an easy comparison to put them together in one book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes sense. And I think the fact that they're joined by this kind of friendship that, goes through some hard times in the book too. But yeah, I think they make sense as kind of foils to one another, and they were both beloved for being so beautiful and such romantic figures. So yeah, ultimately it did just make more sense to kind of think about them in a more focused way alongside one another, rather than trying to kind of like pull in all of these other ideas and interpretations with the other two characters.
So how did you come across Ludwig in the first place? Like you said, that was the first character you wanted to write about. Where did you hear about him?
Yeah, I went on vacation and went to Ludwig's castle Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, and went on a tour of it and just got obsessed with the story. Loved just being inside of the castle and what a romantic space it is, but then also was totally taken in by the whole mysterious ending thing, and wondering like, okay, so do people really not know what happened, or has it just been covered up over time, or what? So yeah, so my last novel was not historical fiction, but was like a haunted house book, contemporary haunted house book. And so the idea of kind of psychologically loaded spaces and the idea of using architecture as an expression of internal states is something that was already kind of interest to me. And so then being in a space like that, like his palace, was, I think I was like intrigued by the idea of approaching some similar ideas in a very different way.
So have you written historical fiction before this? Like even unpublished? No. Okay.
No. Yeah, this is totally new to me. Now, granted, I've been working on it since 2015. So, now I'm 8 years in, but no, I just, who knows why I thought that was something good to do. I was excited about the idea of just thinking about another time and place, I think. And also the allure of trying to figure out how to make a novel out of kind of facts that already had their own timeline and arc, and figuring out, okay, what does that look like in a fictionalized way then?
Yeah, you've got at the very end of the book, I think I remember there was like a very long list of kind of like, here's the readings I did. So like you've done the research clearly.
Yeah, too much research probably, but I wouldn't change it because I feel like it helped me believe that I knew what I was talking about. And I needed to convince myself that I was qualified to write what I was writing about.
And the style of it is a typical historical fiction novel would often take, like, here's 2 or 3 or 5 years in the life of somebody, and they kind of I don't know how to describe the way that your book is different from that. Well, your book, there's a huge swath of time that it covers, but also it's got this kind of like the voice of the it's not a narrator, but the voice of the author is very present. It's kind of, I don't know what to compare it to, but yeah, the style of it is very different and unique. And how did you come upon that as your style?
Yeah, I would say that it is like an involved narrator. Like like it has the narrator has an opinion about the characters and about the choices that they're making. And, I think that it covers the entirety of their lives, like it's not choosing just like a limited span of time to consider. I wanted to, a lot of that ended up being shaped by the research and just like realizing, okay, here are all the things that are just so fascinating to me that I wanted to include. And that's kind of like, that's what I wanted to do, was to think about, okay, I'm actually don't read a ton of historical fiction. Like I started reading more when I started working on this project and thinking about, okay, what are the kind of like standards of the genre? Who are the people who have departed from those tropes? How have they done it? Why have they done it? With both of these characters, because they're both so obsessed with beauty, they're both kind of resistant to the dominant historical narrative that what they felt was trying to be like manipulated about them. I wanted to try to find a way to tell their stories that also departed from the more accepted formats that are normally taken. And so I kind of arrived at this more fragmented, staccato kind of like jumping around moments of their lives, because it felt truer to me in the way that they kind of experienced joy, or, kind of dipped into depressions, or that it wasn't quite as kind of smoothed over as a typical, historical biography or novel might be.
I'm just remembering there's a part, I forget what the phrase was exactly, but it's after Sisi has had one of her children and she's not doing great emotionally. And then the book says something like, well, because the term postpartum depression hadn't been invented yet, no one knew what was going on with her. So there's like these like modern things. I think some historical fiction novels kind of recreate the writing style of the time period in which they're writing about, but yours is very much like someone from today telling the story is the vibe.
Yeah, absolutely. I was like very aware of that kind of anachronistic voice, because I just I don't know. Yeah. For better or worse, I couldn't think about all of the things that are going on in this story without kind of bringing my current sensibility to it and realizing, no wonder there were all of these problems, like the world was failing them in so many different ways. And granted, they're figures of incredible privilege, but yeah, that kind of like anachronistic thing was in my mind. And, I was thinking about films when I was thinking about the tone of it, like I was thinking about Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, and I was thinking about The Favorite, and thinking about like the way that those feel so current and relevant. And even like I remember seeing Amadeus when I was really young and just being like, what? This is what life was like back then, but realizing, oh, there's this kind of like anachronistic, like kind of sense of humor that's been placed on it and makes it feel more present,
And I love that approach, like in the movies you just mentioned, where when you take something in history, and this is kind of the approach I have on my podcast too. It's like when you take it in history and you treat it like this is an important, special, captured an amber thing, or even when people are talking about Shakespeare's plays or something, it's like, it was like the people off the street who were like illiterate and poor and covered in mud. Like it was funny stories for them to enjoy. And now it's like, we study them in universities so I don't know. Do you know the movie A Knight's Tale, for instance?
Oh, I haven't seen it. No, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that opens with a jousting competition in medieval times, and the crowd is singing "We Will Rock You." Like, it's like, yeah, that song was not written then, but that was the vibe. And to a modern day audience to understand, instead of someone being there with a lute playing "Hey Nani Nani," where we'd be like, oh, this is this is precious, this is whimsical. Where it's like, no, these are just like rhythmical. Like it's like you're in a stadium watching a soccer game. So it's a way, and this is what your book is doing too, I think, just to sort of, instead of being like, oh, it's history, so it has to be like at arm's length. It's like, no, this is what these were people, and here's what they were thinking.
Yeah. Well, good. That's definitely what I was kind of hoping for. And I think, yeah. And that is a thing that, the book's not quite out yet, but just the people that have gotten advanced reader copies and are reading it seem to kind of like understand, or it seems to be reaching an audience of people who might not typically read this kind of thing, and are still finding ways to enjoy it. So that's kind of exciting to me too, to think about, what's the gateway drug to historical fiction.
Yeah. And I think, well, what you said about the fact like it hadn't been a genre you read widely in beforehand, and it wasn't something you had written. So you're coming to it with a real fresh point of view. And so I think that would appeal to a reader who maybe hasn't read this genre before.
Yeah, exactly. I can't kind of fail to comply to the conventions that I don't already know.
Exactly.
Clearly.
Yeah. I was thinking too about, you mentioned something earlier, just kind of the way that society, this is how you kind of treat it in your book, the way that society was putting pressure on Ludwig to be a certain kind of man and on Sisi to be a certain kind of empress. But there's also today's understanding of both of them as these kind of larger than life, mythological almost people. So when you were writing, were you thinking of ways to kind of like disentangle the myth from like, well, what was it really like to be this person?
Yeah. I think I was mostly, I feel like most of the book is thinking about their kind of everyday lived existence for the most part, to the point where at one point my editor was like, well, you need to remind the audience that what people actually thought of these two figures is that they loved them. And they just like, even though they, you're painting them in this way where they're really complex and maybe sometimes problematic, like the general population just loved these people. Mm-hmm. And I was like, right. Yes. Okay. That is what I knew about them first. And I've gotten too in the weeds of like showing their kind of like the boredom or loneliness or frustrations of their everyday. And we need to like remember that like outside of the palace walls, everyone is, hunting the countryside to see if Ludwig dropped a glove or something,
Yeah, there's a scene in the book, I forget exactly what era it's in, but Sisi is like beloved, everybody loves her, and she just is so rarely in public. It was shortly after she had given birth to one of her children.
Yeah.
And she's thinking about like, people are just like, oh, she's so beautiful, and she's like, if you could see the like pus and the like blood and the like the fact she had just given birth, and she's just like, if like she wants to show them like the pus covered rags between her legs, she's like, really you think this is beautiful? And I was like, yeah, like,
right.
It was just such a good comparing the public perception with like the human being that she was. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they're, everyday life is so gross, especially when you just given birth or something like that, Yeah. So, Sisi, well, I think both of them, but Sisi in particular, I think has such a kind of like dysmorphic idea of what she looks like. And feels this need to stay beautiful so that people like, because she feels like the public, that's what they value her for, but also is kind of disbelieving of the reasons that they're valuing her, and if she is living up to their expectations. And so, the way that she thinks she looks and the way that people see her is very, very different.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you said you've been working on this book since 2015? So how could you or your editor or your publisher have known that it's coming out in this era where suddenly there's this resurgence of interest in Sisi? There's like there was the Netflix series, I think it was called The Empress. That was like really popular, the German series. Then there's this movie Corsage is coming out. There's been like a number
so
of
excited to see it.
I'm so excited to see Corsage. I think you heard the podcast I did with Lana Wood Johnson, who's like Sisi's number one fan. She's just like this, like the vibe seems correct because a lot of the other projects have been like, she's this romantic, cheerful, skipping around the palace person where it's like, no, she's this like nihilistic, chain smoking, like it seems like Corsage gets it, like in that era of her life.
Yeah, I agree. I know. When I only found out about Corsage maybe, a couple months ago or something, but I'd known about the German Sisi series for a while. I was like, well, maybe it won't be that big because it's in German, like I wasn't sure. And then I was expressing trepidation to my agent and my editor, and they were like, I think it's still just a good thing because it's like, if there's interest in her right now, then it'll only drive interest in the book, So, but it is, it's a kind of terrifying thing as a writer to be like, okay, I've spent the last 8 years working on this, and now it's going to come out at the same time that there's all this other stuff coming out. It's like reminds me of that time that like there were 2 Truman Capote movies that came out in the same year or something, But I don't know. It's just, it is what it is. I'm okay with it. I don't regret having spent the time that I've spent thinking about her and learning about her, So
I think it's only good, the timing, just to have. Well, I'm always happy when any project about a woman from history comes out in general, because it's just like the world needs more of that in general. But I think also if people are like, oh, Empress Sisi, like maybe that you would watch the Netflix series, and then you're like, oh, who's this person? And then that person's going to be like, I want to read more about it. And then your book is there to kind of like expand and to kind of like delve into like the darker corners. I have not seen the Netflix series myself yet. I know that lots of people have and lots of people really like it, but I believe it presents Sisi as a love story between her and her husband, which is
which I do not feel like her relationship with Franz really is. Like, I don't know. I think he's very devoted to her. And I think when they start out, she's very, she's so young.
She's like 15 or something. Yeah. Right? Like, there's a part in your book where something happened. She's had, I think, 3 children, and she's like, she's now 19. And I was like, she's 19.
Yeah.
So much has happened. Oh my God. But yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. So, like, I think that she thinks that she like really cares about him early on, but like he's probably the first person to ever like show her any interest whatsoever. So of course she was taken in, Yeah, but I do not think that they had a very romantic relationship in their life. And I also think that, I watched the season of the series because I think they're making more because it ends very early in her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that they're still kind of making her out to be, and maybe this is because they're still in the early part of her life where she's younger, still making her out to be this almost kind of like manic pixie dream girl kind of version of Sisi, where she's like, she's very adventurous and energetic and a little bit rebellious, but not a ton, And they've also, I think really interestingly, baked in a couple other like kind of possible storylines into the narrative that I'm like, well, that's not what happened. And that also feels just really soap opera-ish to suggest that it could have. So I don't know.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. Yeah, well, that must be so interesting. Like, okay, the level, like when I read your book, I had done research on Sisi. I'd done podcasts about her. So I was reading, I was just like, oh, this part. Oh, I remember this part. So I was just like enjoying it because so for you, where you've done so much research to watch someone else's take of it, you'd be like, oh, that part. And then when they veer, you're like, wait, you're doing what with that part? Like,
yeah, no, it is so fun, to see that. And it's a nice reminder that, like, it's fiction for a reason, and so you get to kind of like manipulate the facts in the way that you need to like get the kind of point across to the audience. I think it's also, going back to that kind of like imposter phenomenon of like, oh, do I know enough about this to be writing about it? It's like nice to watch something like that and to be able to identify, well, that's not true. This is true. That's not true. It's very gratifying.
Yeah. Well, and I think so. And what's your take on, if we're just like debunking love stories, Ludwig and Wagner? What's your take on their relationship?
Yeah, so my feeling about this, I feel like everybody, when I talk about Ludwig and Wagner, the people who know a little bit about them say like, oh, well, Ludwig was in love with Wagner, right? Because like, I don't know if we've even touched on this yet, but Ludwig's clearly gay, and so, and they had this close friendship. And so people are like, oh, he must have also been in love with Wagner, right? But I really don't think he was. Like, from everything that I read, like, all of I get it. Like, the letters between them are really effusive. They spend like each other's birthdays together. But when you look at like what happens on the birthdays, it's like Wagner hired 4 trumpeters to stand on parapets of the castle and play Lohengrin. Like it's not like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem to me like it's romance. And another reason, and this is just like my own kind of feeling about this, but Ludwig really disliked anyone who was less than stunningly beautiful. And Wagner was not a beautiful specimen. And I think that Ludwig loved the art that Wagner made. I think he was incredibly moved by the operas, but I just don't see Ludwig falling in love with an older man who is anything less than gorgeous. And, you know, maybe it's the exception. Maybe he was, you know, but like from everything that I read, I just don't think so.
And that's the tricky thing sometimes about, like, I do not know a lot about like queer history. I'm learning bits and pieces here and there as I'm working on this podcast. But so when you find two men in history, and you know, there's a podcast called Historically Very Good Friends that just like delves into this. But it's like, oh, they were best friends, they lived together, like, you know, so it's,
but sometimes they are just best friends.
Exactly. So
and it's like if a character, you know, if a figure is queer and it was covered up, it doesn't mean that every person of the same sex, like that they were romantically linked to them. And that's what I think something that sort of like gets like interpreted that way because of that lack of visibility into like who were the romantic relationships were. And but Ludwig, I think there are definitely people who it's clear that he had romantic relationships with, but I think that people just kind of like read that same interpretation onto Wagner, and I don't think it was. Yeah.
Well, and I love in your book, there's like a passage where, and this is where like the Lola stuff you set up kind of like echoes again when he's like so enamored with Wagner, and I forget who it is, the like politicians are just like, oh, this is just like, what should we call him? Like, it's like Lola Part 2 or something.
Right. Yeah.
But the difference was how much money he was giving Wagner, which was an incredible amount of money.
Yes. Yeah, because Wagner would threaten to be like, oh, well, I guess I can't write any more operas then if you don't buy me this beautiful home in the Bererstrasse and like and give me tons of money to then, you know, also build a theater and pay for not just one opera but a 4-part mega opera. And I mean, and Ludwig was constantly terrified. He'd sort of try to hold back and not give him the money, and then he'd freak out and realize like, no, I need more operas. And you know, like even to the point of, you know, like I from people have also asked about that kind of like Wagner's very true and very sordid history with like anti-Semitism and you know, like how do you kind of reckon with that in terms of Ludwig? And at least from my research, it seemed like every time Wagner tried to use Ludwig's name, like towards those goals, Ludwig would kind of pull back from his friendship with Wagner and say like we can't, like, you can't just like pretend like those are my beliefs and that I'm supporting them. You're kind of like forwarding of them. Like we need to take some space now. And so that was his level of commitment to opera, was like still kind of like pushing past realizing that the artist that you're a patron to is trying to further these really, really troubling politics that, you know, he didn't believe in himself.
Well, and that's what's interesting too. Like your book really, it really gives a whole picture of both of them as people, like not just as like these famously attractive people or these kind of like famously like weird people, but also showing their kind of where they have convictions. You know, like Sisi's work with Hungary. Like, I think is a really interesting aspect to her character, where she's so much remembered for being like beautiful and like mental illness and like eating disorders, but her commitment to building hospitals, to really being there for Hungary. I don't know, what were your thoughts about that angle of her character?
Yeah, it was like very, I mean, honestly, like a kind of heartbreaking aspect of the research that she kind of kept trying to use her power for good, and it would just take so long for anyone to take her seriously. And so, you know, she'd like kind of try to befriend the people who she thought might help her accomplish what she thought it would be helpful to accomplish. Like she befriends Franz Dake and Julius Andrassy in Hungary, you know, and it's sort of like she'll ask her husband, the emperor, for him to make changes in Hungary to like kind of help grow Hungary's allegiance to Austria and give them a little bit more autonomy. And her husband ignores her, but like if he then would go to Dake or Andrashi and say, what should I do about this? If they said the same thing that Sisi said, he'd be like, oh, okay, let's do it. And, it's just like, it's so familiar in terms of, I just think of like stories of women in tech now, or like so many different venues, right? But like women in tech who like, will be at a meeting and make a suggestion and everyone's like, no, I don't think so. And then a guy will say the exact same thing. And they're like, right, good idea. It's just like, am I losing my mind? Like, it's a total like gaslighting situation because it's like, why, what is it that is not allowing other people to hear me or trust my judgment or, like my point of view on the situation. So yeah. So in terms of Sisi asking for more hospitals, like during a time when there were all of these soldiers coming home to Austria who needed care. And like during a time when the country was moving into a great national depression that was causing like a mass number of suicides because of the financial depression, like she was asking for hospitals to be built too. And Franzel almost treated her like it was just like, she was just asking for like a dollhouse or something, like a little plaything to, like where she could go and visit her little patients or something.
And that's the thing, like, there's a part in your book and like / also in history where she goes to visit the hospitals and people are just so moved to see her and it's like her beauty, but also they see her almost like an angel. And I'm just like, oh, this is like Princess Diana vibes. Like,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a total Princess Diana thing. Yeah. I think it's very similar. Absolutely.
I don't know. It's just like, again, your book is coming out in the wake of like Prince Harry's book and whatever, and like The Crown, and people are just like re-examining Diana's legacy in a way. And I think just stuff like the disordered eating and like being known for her beauty and being dissatisfied in her marriage. Like there's so many parallels there too between her and Sisi.
Yeah, there is. Like I have to admit, like I'm not like I don't follow British royals,
Nor
like I know all of the things that you're talking about,
No
like
one should. But
yeah, it's like, yeah, I mean, these things repeat themselves so much. And I also totally understand that there are so many problems that women face, and it is the way to try and gain empathy or sympathy for them by portraying a woman who has more power and privilege than any other woman in the world. Maybe not, but it is also just like interesting to see like, okay, here's a woman who should be happy. She should have everything. And like, what are the limitations even within that kind of realm?
Well, and then also just pivoting again to Ludwig. So he was, I don't know, I feel like in a miniature version, my like couple months studying Ludwig and Sisi and Lola Montez mirrored what you experienced. Cause I was like, okay, I'll do an episode about Sisi. And then in research I'm like, who's Lola Montez? And then I was just like, and who's Ludwig? And who's the first Ludwig? And suddenly I'm just like spiraling. But so Ludwig II, the one who's in your book, like he's known, like there's a board game, The Castles of Mad King Ludwig.
I've never played it, but I need to.
But like the fact that he's known as Mad King Ludwig, the guy who built the castles, like what was that like to examine him just from a more empathetic point of view? Not just like this crazy king.
Yeah. I think that is kind of like tied to what we're saying about like the way that like, with one identifier or descriptor, all of a sudden you're like seeing everything is related to that thing, like in terms of like, oh, he's queer. So all of his male friendships must have been romantic, right? Where it's also like, oh, he was mad. So everything that he was doing was totally mad, right? But like, if you look at Ludwig, like historically, like Ludwig I too was also obsessed with building. Like the reason that he was revered so highly and was held in such high regard was he basically like built up all of the important buildings, historical buildings in Munich that are there now, like museums and concert halls and things like that. And if you go to say like the Nymphenburg Palace, like it's very similar in the same way to Ludwig would build these palaces and build all of these little like quaint ornamental outbuildings in the like grounds around the palace. And people would be like, oh, it's unreasonable. There's a Moorish kiosk and there's like a oriental bathhouse. And there's all these like little, buildings that are just like little baubles on the grounds. Right. But Ludwig I was doing the exact same thing, and people didn't think that he was out of his mind, even though he was kind of like obsessed with like building and supporting the arts, So I think it's just all a matter of like, yeah, what is that kind of label that you're applying to everything? And granted, both Ludwig and Sisi have ties to this Wittelsbach line that there was an incredible amount of inbreeding. And there were family members who had real struggles, with mental health. And I think that was something that I was just thinking a lot about in this book, is like knowing that there's that precedent in the family line. What is the relationship that a person can have to trusting themselves too, in terms of like, okay, like, am I thinking through this clearly, or is this, some inherited thing that's like bubbling forth right now, And with Ludwig, of course, then too, being queer, he has this thing that must feel just like so important and huge that he has to keep as secret as possible. And, and so he's finding other ways to cope and to express himself. And other people are reading that as madness too, in the same way that they would have read his queerness as madness at the time, And so, yeah, I think Ludwig is just an incredibly sympathetic figure. I think that he wasn't born to do that job. And ideally, he would have kind of been allowed to opt out of it at some point.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'm just thinking what you're saying, and that really echoes so much with, I think, of Sisi and how she's seen then and how she's often seen now, or has been, by biographers, where it's just like, okay, well, she's a woman who had mental health issues. Like, she clearly had depression. She clearly had disordered eating, where it's just like, okay, so then was everything, I don't know, you were saying like how he found ways to cope, Ludwig, like with, having to be closeted and whatever. So Sisi had these issues, and then she dealt with it by like going for incredibly long hikes and by horseback riding and by like really stringently maintaining her appearance, where it's like, but everything she did doesn't have to relate back to her mental health.
Right. Like, I feel like we're in a moment now where, like, if you can use exercise to treat your mental health, like, why wouldn't you, right? But like, Sisi is like punished for it, or seen as like, as being negligent to the kingdom, because she's like trying to find healthy ways to kind of like, well, healthy or not, like orthorexia is a real thing, and like over exercising, as a way of kind of like controlling your body. But yeah, I think she's doing the same thing. I think we're all doing the same thing, right? Like, we're trying to survive, and we're figuring out how to do it in a way that, like, where we can keep moving forward.
Well, and I think that's also the thing too, is that for both of them, like, they had like mental health stuff going on, and yet neither of their stories end with them taking their own life. Like, they both ended up being kind of randomly murdered. Like, they found ways to cope, and those ways like were working for them, for better or for worse. Like, they were, Sisi, I appreciate that she spent so much of her time just traveling. I love the way that you put it in your book, and it was the impression I got as well, where she was just like, oh no, I'm sick, could you just send me to like this beautiful island off the coast of Portugal? That's the only place I think where I could get better, thanks. And then she's there and she's like, fine, like just like living her life and like eating fine and like being happy. Or she's like, yeah, I don't know, like, in your book, it's so like, I'm like, I know that fact. And I'm like, well, I don't know that fact, but that sounds like a true fact. So I'm just like, I don't know what you're making up and what you're not. Like, it just all reads as like, that makes sense.
Most of it's true. Yeah, most of it's true. Like, scenes are imagined, or like, so, a few characters are combined in each of their storylines, to just sort of like make it a little easier to follow from beginning to end and not overcomplicating it. But for the most part, most of it has some like root in a seed of fact. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like what you're saying about Sisi traveling too, they both kind of have that, right? Like, they're both kind of convinced that, that like, if they could just go somewhere else, they could live the life that they want to. Like in the end of Ludwig's life, he starts sending out servants to like try to find a new place he could establish a kingdom, like convinced that he could, just like if he could just be somewhere else, then he could live the life that he wants to live, and they come back with like places that he could maybe build a summer home or something. But like, he's like, no, I want a kingdom, and it's like this kind of like a messed up way that he's convinced that like he needs to stay king to keep doing the things that he's doing. But, Sisi is the same in the way that she kind of just keeps traveling to all of these places. And then she'll, like in Corfu, she builds this beautiful house and her husband thinks like, finally, she'll be happy here. But then she just kind of gets tired of it quickly and wants to go somewhere else,
Yeah.
So it's like, I think they're both seekers, like I feel like I hear the word seeker all the time now, like people who are like really trying to like find the thing that will complete them or give them answers about their lives. And I think that Sisi and Ludwig are both seekers, and that they try to kind of keep trying all these different ways to make themselves happy, and are not, could be successful if they could just realize that the journey is more important than the destination.
Yeah.
To speak in cliches.
Yeah, well, it's just like if you keep trying to find the thing that'll make you happy, but you're inherently not happy, like a thing's not going to make you happy. Like that's
Yeah.
But well, that's the thing too. That's just reading like a book like yours that really delves into just kind of the psychology of it all, of the psychology of people before therapy was a thing. Where I'm just like, ooh, here's what I would suggest if I was Ludwig's friend, but it's like, but no one's going to suggest that then. And like, fair enough. So he just like does what he needs to do. I think you've explained your book so well that I think everyone understands now why they need to read it. But do you have any other persuasive things to say to convince people to read your book?
Oh, well, if you're just looking for a rabbit hole to go down, I feel like there are lots and lots of minor characters to just like dig in on, like plenty more beyond the ones that I had initially planned to, include as full storylines, like lots of good Wikipedia-ing, to make that a verb, to do while reading, because, usually the one little detail I've included about someone is just the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, I don't know that people need more material in their lives to just kind of keep like finding new tangents to go down. But I do think that there's lots more built into it.
Well, and I think you mentioned, what was the name of the sculptor / spy?
Elizabeth Ney.
Yeah. So you mentioned like she shows up in the book and I was just like, Elizabeth Ney. I'm just like, write that down. Research her for the podcast maybe one day. Like the fact that you had more about her before, or like even Lola, like for people who don't know about her, you clearly know so much about these side characters who had been more, that when you're reading the book, you're like, oh, that's intriguing. And then, and because it's based in history, it's like, oh, you can read more about these people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She leaves Germany and moves to the US with her husband. They settle down in Georgia, where I guess there's just like a population of German expats who moved there to treat tuberculosis because they heard that the weather was dry, which I think is really funny for Georgia. And then that doesn't go well, so they move to Austin, Texas, and she like spends the rest of her life running a farm and also trying to prove that women artists are valuable. But like, of all places to try to do that, Texas is not the place, Yeah, it's a fascinating history. And, like I just think about, like I did so much travel for this book too, in terms of researching people and places. And for Elizabeth Ney, like I went to her plantation outside of Hempstead, Texas, and booked myself a tour, but they didn't have regular tours. You needed to buy a group tour, but they were only $100. So I went on a group tour alone with a woman in like a corset and a hoop skirt, like telling me about the house. And I was like, you can take that costume off. It's just the two of us. And she was like, no, I'm fine. And she had to keep sitting down because she couldn't catch her breath. And it was like, there are like aspects of the research for this book that I was just like I went too far.
Yeah.
Like I did not need to do all of that, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Yeah.
You know, like that's the whole point, is enjoying the sort of the gaining of that knowledge, you know, and seeing all of the places. I think that was the most important and exciting aspect of the research to me, was to go to these places and to feel like what it was like to be in them.
Do you have any events planned? Because this episode is going to come out like just as your book is being published. Like on your website, like people can know where to see you and to come in.
Yeah. There are details about events on my website, but I will be in. I live in San Diego, so there will be an event in San Diego, LA, Portland, New York, Chicago, and then hopefully the Bay Area too. We're trying to set something up.
Well, that's perfect. Just because I know from like the analytics that I see, there's a lot of listeners to the podcast who live on the West Coast. So they should all go.
Yeah. Yes, please. I would love to see everyone.
And that's nice that I've interviewed a number of authors on this podcast, and it's nice that your book is coming out in a time where you can do events.
Yes, I know. It's so wonderful to be back in rooms with people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Rather than just Zooming it all.
Yeah. It makes such a difference.
Can you say, so your book is Empty Theater. Can you read the title one more time, please?
Yes. Yes, I can. I can read it, but not recite it. Or The Lives of King Ludwig II of Bavaria and Empress Sisi of Austria, Queen of Hungary, cousins in their pursuit of connection and beauty, despite the expectations placed on them because of the exceptional good fortune of their status as beloved national figures, with speculation into the mysterious nature of their deaths.
Why did you decide to make that the subtitle?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the reason is because my editor was like, can we make a subtitle like with Sisi and Ludwig's name in it? And I was like, no, no, I hate that idea, because it's going to sound like it's nonfiction or something. It's going to be so dry. Like if it's Empty Theater, the Ludwig and Sisi story.
Yeah.
But then like we were doing research into 18th and 19th century novels, and Victorian novels all have these beautiful long subtitles that basically tell you exactly what happens in them. And so like the subtitle for Robinson Crusoe is also like a paragraph long. So we realized there's this kind of timely historical referent for a big long title like that. So yeah, I just had a fun time kind of figuring out what I wanted to be in the title, like as it connected with what the book eventually became.
And the chapters have names like that too, don't they?
Yeah. Well, some are long, but most are pretty short.
But like they have a little like in this chapter this happens, and I love that. I love that. When I was a little kid writing novels for my own amusement, I would always give my chapters these long like, and in this chapter this happens, this happens, this happens. Like
I think they call that an argument. Yeah, I think I learned that that's the official word for it. If you kind of like start your if the title of your chapter kind of explains what will happen in the chapter.
Yeah. Well, and that's just such a really elegant but also irreverent way for like a book like yours that is an unconventional not nonfiction, historical fiction novel, but to be using the stylistic elements of a classic novel from that era. I don't know. It all melts together really beautifully, and I'm impressed that your cover designer fit the whole title on the cover.
Yes, me too. Yeah, I was like, how is this going to work? But yeah, I feel like she did it in a way that it's almost like, it doesn't feel like too overwhelming. But when you realize it's there, it's just kind of fun and a little surprising. So,
yeah. Well, thank you so much. I was really looking forward to talking to you, and it was great to get this recorded so everybody can know all about your book.
Thank you. I am such a fan of the podcast, and it is just such a thrill to get to be a guest. Thank you.
So here's the thing. This, turns out, has been the 100th episode of Vulgar History, which is really huge and really exciting, and I never would have done this many episodes were it not for you, the Tits Out Brigade, and all of your enthusiasm. We've also just hit another milestone in terms of like statistics, which is recently there's been 2 million downloads of this podcast, Vulgar History. which is, frankly, a surreal number that sounds fake to me. But this is all because of you, the Tits Out Brigade, your enthusiasm, spreading the word, telling your friends about it. It's really been a really organic growth of finding listeners that I really, truly appreciate. And so, as an appreciation to you all to celebrate the 100 episode anniversary, I am going to be hosting a YouTube live event on Saturday, March 4th at 7 p.m. Central, which is 8 p.m. Eastern, which is 5 p.m. on the West Coast. If you go to youtube.com/vulgarhistory, I would imagine if you go there in your time zone, it'll tell you what time zone, what time you can watch that. Anyway, because I know there's listeners all around the world, I am happy to do this as an online event, so you can watch it from wherever you are. I'm going to be joined for this by friends of the podcast. You know them, you love them, Allison Epstein, Lana Wood Johnson, and we're going to talk about the 1986 movie Lady Jane, which stars Helena Bonham Carter, who is a literal child in this movie, Carrie Elways from The Princess Bride, as well as Patrick Stewart is in it wearing a wig. So if you want to watch that movie to prepare to watch this super special YouTube live presentation, it's called Lady Jane, and it's available to rent and stream in basically most of the usual spots where you find films. And yeah, so that's coming up. And as ever, you can also reach out to me if for whatever reason you want to reach out to me. There's a form if you go to vulgarhistory.com. You can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, where again, you can go to see the picture of Jac at Lola Montez's grave. Iconic picture. And I'm also on TikTok at Vulgar History. If you want to support this little podcast, you can support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, where for $1 a month, you get early access and also ad-free episodes of Vulgar History. And for $5 a month, you get access to bonus episodes. So I do So This Asshole episodes every month. Like I just recently had you heard there was the Napoleon one, there was the Charles Dickens one. I'm working right now on F. Scott Fitzgerald. Coming up, I'm going to be talking about Rasputin. I'm going to be talking about Wagner, tie into Jac's book. Anyway, so that's if you support me on Patreon for at least $5 a month, you get all these bonus episodes. And you can keep shopping for your Vulgar History merch at vulgarhistory.store, where you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. And anyway, until next week, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Ciri? This is how you deal with fear!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa. Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.